question or anything. So the Hebrews, right, just like other peoples, they were very fond of social gathering, social feasting. We just talked about it. So these festivals of Israel were communal and commemorative in that they were communal, they were commemorative, they were uh, uh, theological, they were also typological at the three great religious feasts. The first one that we just saw there, the first three ones, huh? All males were expected to attend. All males were expected to attend. You see that? That's why I said the word convocation, it may convey the idea of everybody gathering, but that's not because some of these feasts or festivals, not all, but the first three, all males had to attend. Uh, All males had to attend. Sacrifices were accompanied by a feast. See that? Sacrifices were accompanied by a feast. They were in the Old Testament. I'm talking about feasts in general now. In general, in the Old Testament, there were feasts for birthdays. So today, Anele has a birthday. We can feast and celebrate a birthday. So in the Old Testament, there were feasts for birthdays. There were feasts for marriages. There were feasts for funerals. There were feasts for laying of foundations. There were feasts for vintage. What do you call it? Vintage by vintage. I'm making a reference to winery. There were feasts for sheep shearing. You remember David and what's his name? The Abigail and Abigail's husband. There were feasts held for these things, and on other occasions, right? So you can see how there's a difference between other feasts and what we're talking about in Leviticus 23. Like I said, it is what? The word feast there is what? It means appointed time, appointed time. And I also say what? The feasts and fasts go together. So the Day of Atonement, for example, is a day of fasting, even though it's called a feast. So you feasting on nothing. You feasting on spiritual food that day. That's what it really means. And we know these are the feasts that what Moses introduced according to God's direction. Okay, so I know that earlier that the key reference point for the feast in the Old Testament is Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 is what describes the Sabbath together with the seven feasts. I'm doing a little bit of summary here, recap here. Okay. So Leviticus 23 describes the Sabbath together with seven feasts. Again, we saw the feasts, which are what? Which are the feast of the Passover, the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of first fruits, the feast of the harvest, feast of trumpets, the day of atonement, and what? The feast of tabernacles. And there are what? These are what? Appointed seasons for holy convocations. These are appointed seasons for holy convocations. And you know what? According to Genesis 1:14, the sun and moon were created to be what? For signs and seasons. So now we're tying the calendar to what we're talking about here. Genesis 1:14 talked about the sun and moon being what when God created them, they were created for what? For signs and seasons. And then when we fast forward to Leviticus, we're talking about feasts. But God uses these are what? The appointed times and the holy convocation. So you see, right way back there, God had put in place a calendar or what would determine how we identify the days, the months, and the years. Calendar. See? And interestingly, in Genesis 1:14, which we looked at, I think you can recall we said it that Genesis 1:14, when we look at it, the word used there talk about signs and seasons, it literally means meetings to meet. And you see how in Leviticus 23 it says what? The 7 feasts they got together, the 7 appointed times to count together. And this is interesting, like I said, because in Leviticus 23, verses 2, verse 4, and verse 44, reference is made to what? The Lord's meetings. And in verse 37 of Leviticus 23, to what? To appointed seasons. Amazing. I mean, this passage, this chapter, it looks dry and boring, and oh my gosh, okay, well, too technical, whatever it is, but it contains a lot that we need to understand. So, what are the purposes of the feast? The feast, first of all, we say the feast belong to God, right? It is to the feasts are there to commemorate His faithfulness, the miracles of deliverance, which He performed when He set apart the people of Israel as His own. These feasts in Leviticus 23 are there to serve as a reminder of God's people, of His holiness. That's why, like I said, it starts with the Sabbath. Leviticus 23 verse 3 starts with this Sabbath. See, to recognize God's holiness. At the same time, recognize how impure they are. And that in spite of the difference between them and God, God still wants them to be in fellowship with Him. That's us too. God wants us to draw near to Him. These feasts, God's feast, God is throwing a party. In fact, what I have, the notes that I have in my Bible, is what? God throws the party. And when God throws a party, look at it. God wants them to be in fellowship with Him. He wants them to draw near to Him. And you see, to draw near to God, for you and I, the only way we can draw near to God is, first of all, be born again and be obedient to Him. So to draw near to God in such times like this is what? To be obedient, show thanksgiving to God, and to sacrifice. Sacrifice your time, sacrifice, a little of what He has given you back to Him. See that? So these feasts of these appointed times or meetings are designed to fulfill the obligation to hand down to our children the knowledge of God and His work of deliverance and redemption in our history. So we pass it on. When we have these meetings, we pass it on to the younger ones in our midst. So that the feasts are commemorative. Two, the feasts were communal. What do I mean by that? Well, it drew the people together. It drew them together for celebration, for worship, at the same time as they recalled or remembered the common origin and their experience as a people. So communal. Three, it kept alive in terms of commemoration, right? It kept alive the story of what God had done for them. Exodus, living in the wilderness, some of that. Four, uh, uh, it was theological. The feasts were theological. What do I mean by that? Well, the observance of the festivals presented the people, God's people, with lessons on the reality of sin, God's holiness, judgment, forgiveness, in fact, the need also to give thanks to God. most importantly, the importance of trusting God rather than hoarding what God had given them. So theological means what? You give of yourself to God. You give, like offerings. You offer yourself to God. You offer what God has blessed you with back to Him. When you have these feasts, you recognize the need for forgiveness. You recognize that you ought to give thanks to God for bringing you through the week, the work week, the school week to Friday night. What we said, you want to give thanks. You want to trust God for tomorrow. So there were lessons embedded in these feasts, God's feasts. And then the fifth one is what? These feasts were typological. Typological. What do I mean by that? Well, as I said before, these feasts pointed to the future. Pointed to the future. So the people of Israel expected what? They expected a greater fulfillment of the symbolism of those feasts that they were having. That is why when Jesus Christ was on earth, the disciples would say, "Oh, are you the one?" John the Baptist, "Are you the one who's supposed to come?" The disciples said, "Are you the one?" And later on, it was Peter who said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," because they were expecting a Messiah. And many of them, sadly, didn't recognize him. He was in the feast. They knew the feast was pointing, but look at it. Passover. Passover, they didn't even realize that the celebration of the Passover was pointing to this man, Jesus Christ, who they were going to crucify. You see that? So these seven feasts were typological in nature, pointing to Jesus Christ.